Check, check. What is up, Iron Crew? Welcome back to another episode of the Iron Crew podcast. I am your host, Danny. Thank you for tuning into episode number 43. I am joined today by Michael Sugrue. Michael is a retired police sergeant and former U.S. Air Force captain who currently dedicates his time as an advocate for first responder suicide and post-traumatic stress injury, also known as PTSI. A few years back, Michael was involved in a very serious incident in which he was forced to take another human life. Michael was kind and generous enough to share this story with us. He talks about the incident, he talks about the aftermath, and the effects that all of that had on his psyche, his emotional state, and his physical state as well. And he talks about PTSD, depression, anxiety, and all of the things that surround what is typically a very, very stressful job, being a first responder. And whether you're a police officer, you're a medic, you're a firefighter, you're an ER hospital staff, whether you just have a very stressful job in general, PTSD, anxiety, and depression can manifest itself in many different ways. And Michael talks about that in this episode. He talks about the signs, the symptoms, things to look out for, ways to prevent it, ways to approach a colleague who you may suspect is suffering from any one of these things. And again, it doesn't stop with first responder land. Yes, people who are military, law enforcement, fire, first responders in general are a whole heck of a lot more susceptible to this stuff. But again, it does not stop there. You can be a tech worker, you can work in an office, you can work anywhere, and you can still have anxiety, depression, and stress when it comes to your day-to-day life. And my favorite part about this conversation is how he talks about things to look out for so that you can prevent it from ever happening, and things to do so that you can maintain a stress-free life even in those stressful environments. So I'm super excited to share this conversation with you with Michael Sugrue. And as you all know, law enforcement is near and dear to my heart. I was a cop for 11 years, and when I was speaking with Michael, so many things rang true for me, and I couldn't help but go down memory lane and think about all of the good and the bad that came from my time as a law enforcement officer. I am very thankful that I spent those 11 years in uniform. I learned a ton about life, society, humanity as a whole, and I just learned a lot about the way things work. But at the same time, there were a lot of things that were pretty negative during my time. And I'd like to share with you a few of the things that I really haven't shared with that many people, starting with some of the things that I was experiencing on a regular basis that I think a lot of people may or may not relate to, whether you're a first responder or not. But I'm just going to go down the line of some of the things that were happening during my time in law enforcement that no longer happen. Number one, I had dreams. I had these recurring dreams, and they all surrounded the equipment that I carried on duty. My gun, my taser, my baton, pepper spray, shoot, even things like my hands, like if I was trying to grab somebody. And during these dreams, those things wouldn't work. And, I would have these recurring dreams probably once a month, once every 2 to 3 months at the most. And it was always a situation where there was a bad guy and I was trying to subdue them. And I would, for example, be running to go catch somebody and like my legs wouldn't work. Or I was in a fight with somebody and I was trying to grab my baton, and then when I went to go strike their legs with my baton, it didn't work, or the baton broke, or like I missed, or something happened to where like the equipment didn't work. The other very often recurring one was when I would pull out my gun and I would pull the trigger and nothing would happen. It would malfunction, nothing would happen. All I would hear was a click, and then every single time that one came about, I woke up right as the trigger failed. And I remember having those dreams over and over and over again. And they stopped once I resigned as a police officer, and I haven't had any of that type of dream since. And it's just something that I think a lot of cops suffer from, and it doesn't get talked about enough. And I think that it's something that needs to get talked about, that there is doubt that the equipment might not work. A couple of other things that Michael and I talked about a little bit, but that I can relate to, is just the day-to-day stress that dealing with what I like to call the bottom 3% of society. And whether we like to admit it or not, cops are constantly dealing with what I like to call the bottom 3% of society. Think about it from your end as your good Samaritan who isn't a bad person. When is the last time you called 911? Usually it's very infrequent, and usually when that happens, either one, a situation has gotten so out of hand that you cannot handle it yourself. So that's a bad fucking situation. Number two, you are at your lowest point of your life, whether you got into a fight with somebody or something bad happened, maybe you got too drunk, or maybe you got high, or something happened to where the cops had to get called, and they find you at your lowest point. So regardless of why you call 911 or why 911 was called, the police officer is showing up at a very shitty point in these people's lives. Now imagine what that did to you. Just imagine the lowest point of your life, and let's just say you had to call 911 for it. That is a police officer's day, multiple times a day, every single day that they go to work. Every time they get dispatched to a call, it is because somebody is at the lowest point of their life. Usually, something bad has happened. And all of that negativity has a huge compounding effect on a person's emotional state, their psyche, and how it manifests itself. And Michael and I talk about this, but how it manifests itself in me is that I found myself being less and less patient, and I found myself trusting less and less people. And so, I would be at the grocery store and all I could see was the crackhead over in the corner. Or I'd be out on a date and I would have to sit with my back against a wall so that I could see the entrance because I didn't want to get caught off guard. And I couldn't hold a conversation with somebody without looking over my shoulder to make sure nobody shady was around. And these are the kinds of things that happen on a daily basis to police officers, not only at work, but off duty too. It's hard to turn off that switch. And I think that's one of the main reasons why so many first responders, law enforcement in particular, have a very hard time with depression, anxiety, and stress, because it's hard to shut that switch off. So I feel for anybody out there in uniform. And for those of you who don't know that, just know that that is the day-to-day life of a police officer. They might be putting on a good front. They might be smiling, and they might be saying, hello, sir, hello, ma'am. But oftentimes they do this job long enough, and it definitely wears on people. Now, with all that negativity comes some really, really good things that has helped me in my day-to-day life. Number one, I'm more aware of my surroundings. Like I said, with the good comes the bad, or with the bad comes the good. And although I'm super hyper aware of all the bad things that are going on around me, I'm at the same time very hyper aware of just everything around me. So I'm able to multitask a little bit more. I'm able to see things, out of my peripheral that I might not have been as aware of, because as a cop, you're constantly needing to look around and see things in your peripheral. There's other things too, like where I feel like I see people's intentions or their true intentions a little bit better. Although seeing negative in a lot of people isn't necessarily a good trait, it's also a valuable trait to have, because there's a lot of people out there that are walking around fat, dumb, and happy thinking that everybody has good intentions, when in reality, a lot of people don't have good intentions. And so I think that that's going to prevent myself and my children, hopefully, and Shannon, all the loved ones in my life, to not become victims, because I've hopefully made them aware enough to see certain things and characteristics in people that they might not have seen. And I like to play this game called the shady character game. And I've talked about this before on the podcast with my kids to help them raise awareness and be a little bit more self-aware, or I should say aware of their surroundings for situational awareness. And so we'll be driving down the street and we'll play this game called the shady character game, where we'll be driving and we'll see somebody at the stop, standing on the sidewalk. And let's just say we'll pick out characteristics of that person and say, is that a shady characteristic or is it not a shady characteristic? And what I'm getting at is I want my kids to be able to identify certain circumstances that make a person a little bit sketchy or a little bit shady. So, for example, one time my kids were seeing this guy. It was a relatively warm day, but not super hot. He had his shirt off. He had baggy pants on. He was riding a BMX bike that was really, really small for his frame. His hair was all disheveled. He was smoking a cigarette. He had a backpack that was overflowing with things. He seemed to be talking to himself, and he just kind of seemed to be a little bit nervous. And so I said, guys, what about that guy? Is this person a shady character? And they were like, yeah. And I said, why? And they said, well, he's got no shirt on. I said, okay, sure, that's one indicator, but that in and of itself doesn't make him shady. And they were like, yeah, it does. And right as that was happening, I look over to the other side of on the sidewalk, and there was a guy running with no shirt on, and he was clearly getting a workout in. I said, well, that guy has no shirt on. Does that make him shady? And they said, no. I said, well, why not? He said, because he's getting a workout in. I said, okay, so circumstances dictate whether or not somebody is shady, right? So then they were like, well, he looks like he's talking to himself. Okay, does that in and of itself mean that he is shady? No, but hey, shirt off, talking to himself, those are some clues, right? Hair disheveled, baggy pants, he has a belt on, but he's got baggy pants, he's sagging. You can't really see what's underneath the pants. His backpack, seems like he's living out of it. He's got a BMX bike that's way too small for him. All of these things in and of itself don't make him shady, but the compounding effect of all of those things make him a little bit shady, like, hey, you might want to watch out for that person. And so what I'm getting at is I like to instill these things in my children to help them be a little bit more self-aware so that when they go out into the real world, they are a lot more prepared for some of the bad people that are out there. And then lastly, I had a ton of great training. I mean, that's the fun part of it all is that, I got to learn how to shoot firearms the proper way. I got to learn how to drive a car the proper way in emergency situations. I got to learn how to ride a motorcycle. There's so many different cool things that I was able to experience. My tactical awareness in an active shooter situation is much greater than your average person. And so I like to think that I am very, very lucky when it came to all of the training and experience that I got as a police officer that not everybody gets a chance to take part in, and they can't say that they have or possess those skills, and it's a very rare skill set. Yeah, it's very rare to actually need to use them, but it's one of those things where it's like, when you need it, and there's no time to train or learn it on the fly. You either have it or you don't. So I consider myself blessed to have gone through some of the extensive training that I have because of my time in law enforcement. So those are the things that I'm blessed to have gone through as a police officer. So those are some of the things that I wasn't so blessed to experience as a police officer. But all in all, I had a great career, and I'm glad that I did it. And I'm excited to share this conversation with you because, like I said, that career and first responders in general hold a very special place in my heart. But before we get to that conversation, I want to get into my week that was, a very brief week that was, but my week that was is supported by Kingsfield Fitness. Kingsfield Fitness is an online health and wellness company that is dedicated to providing you with the tools necessary to live a healthy lifestyle. And I gravitated towards their 4-speed vibrating foam roller. Yes, you heard me correctly. There is a foam roller out there that has 4 speeds and vibrates. There is science behind it. I had the owner of Kingsfield Fitness on the podcast. Episode 32, I believe it was. He talks about the science behind the vibrating feature. I fell in love with it, and he and I partnered up, and he agreed to give listeners of this podcast a 20% discount using IronCrew discount code. I also wrote an article on this 4-speed vibrating foam roller and how much I enjoyed it. So head over to the blog. It's ironcrewaathletics.com/blog. Click on the review that I posted on the vibrating foam roller by Kingsfield Fitness. And if it speaks to you and you want to loosen up those tight muscles, give it a shot. Go to kingsfieldfitness.com. When you go to checkout and order that 4-speed vibrating foam roller, use IronCrew at checkout for 20% off. All right, my week that was this past weekend, Shannon and I spent the weekend in Santa Cruz for our birthdays. Our birthdays are, hers is June 1st and mine is May 26th. And we decided to get out of town and go to Santa Cruz, which is a coastal town here in the Bay Area. And we had a great time. She planned the hotel, and it was a resort and spa. And when she booked it, she had this vision in mind. And the pictures spoke to her, and the topography of this resort and spa were really cool, and it spoke to her. And so she clicked on reservations, and she decided that we were going to stay there, right? And she's super excited. She's got this vision in her mind. She's got this expectation. And when we get there, she was like, this doesn't seem the way that I remember it on the channel or the website. And she had this expectation in mind. And it got me thinking about expectations and how expectations sometimes have this negative connotation. And we oftentimes expect things out of people, but when we put it in perspective and we say, hey, I expect this out of somebody or something, it has this negative connotation. And sure, if you do certain things without expectation of it being paid back in your favor, that can be a very rewarding thing. But it's also something to consider that we have expectations for a reason. If you and your partner have an expectation that they're going to be home at a certain hour, then that's an expectation that they should live up to. If you are expecting your children to clean their room, that's an expectation that's reasonable. If the kids are expecting you to have dinner on the table by 6 and it's not there and they're hungry, that's a reasonable expectation. Expectations aren't always bad. Expectations sometimes can help relieve anxiety. If we all like to know what to expect. And when certain things don't live up to the expectation, then it can be a little bit disappointing. So it's a balance. It's a delicate balance between having expectations and setting your standards high, but at the same time not getting too let down if somebody or something doesn't meet those expectations. And this happens in relationships. This happens at work. This happens with your kids. This happens in your exercise routine. This happens all the time. And so the only reason why I'm talking about this is communication is very, very key. With expectations needs to come communication. If you go to a website and the pictures are awesome, it might be wise to go to Google and type in that resort and see what potentially the real photos look like from real people as they are taking it, or the Yelp reviews or other Google reviews where you can get a real sense of what this place might be like if I'm just kind of comparing for our experience at this hotel resort and spa. But this also applies to relationships and work. And, if you and your boss have an expectation and there's not clear communication between the two of you, those lines can get crossed and the expectation might be different depending on which side of the expectation you're on. So I encourage you to not think of expectations as negative things. They are positive, and they can be very, very valuable when implemented properly in your life with clear and proper communication. I've also gotten into this podcast by NPR called How I Built This. And they go into interviewing people who have very successful and lucrative businesses such as Burt's Bees, Peloton, Men's Warehouse, the list goes on. And there's this one thing that I have honed in on, and I want to share it with you guys, that all of these businesses, these successful businesses, the common theme that I've noticed is that it takes years to develop. It doesn't happen overnight. I'll use Peloton as an example. And they seem to have blown up overnight, right? But what we don't realize is that they've been at this since 2012. It's 2019, and they've had seemingly overnight success, yet it's taken them 7 fucking years. And talking to the owner, John Foley, I believe his name is, he talked about how in the early stages in their office, how he was like the cleaning guy. And at night, when everybody went home, he would stay late, vacuum, sweep, clean the toilets, clean the hallways, dust everybody's desks, take out the trash, and make sure that it was up and ready to go for the next day. The CEO, the founder, was the cleaning crew for 2.5 years before they could afford a cleaning crew. That's crazy. And in this day and age with Instagram and Facebook and these quote-unquote overnight successes, hard work is really what it boils down to. And all of these overnight successes didn't happen overnight. I just had a conversation with somebody at the gym who was talking about Barry's boot camp. And I had thought Barry's boot camp was one of those, right, where they just kind of blew up out of nowhere. And she was like, no, they've been around. She was like scratching her head. She's like, they've been around since, I think, 2006. I'm like, dude, 2006? That's crazy. And they're just expanding to different states and different areas of California. And so it just got me thinking that if you're going to start a project, if you're going to start a relationship, if you're going to start a training program, if you're going to come back from anxiety, if you're going to battle your depression, if you're going to turn the tables and go a different direction or start something from scratch, just know it takes hard work, patience, grit, and positivity, relentless positivity and belief in what you're doing before you're going to see the fruits of your labor. So I've recognized this with IronCrew and this podcast, that the shit does not happen overnight, and falling in love with the process is really what it boils down to, and believing in what you do. And so I encourage anybody who's starting anything, again, fitness program, relationship, business idea, whatever it may be, it has to start somewhere. It has to start small, but just know that overnight success will take 7 freaking years before you get anywhere and before you get to have some steam backing that project. So stay patient, stay consistent, stay positive. All right, my next topic is the topic of the common term jerry-rigged, or is it Jimmy-rigged? So at the gym the other day, somebody was mentioning somewhere in the rafters of the gym, they were like, man, that thing looks jerry-rigged. And I was like, what do you mean, Jimmy-rigged? And she's like, no, it's jerry-rigged. I'm like, nah, I call that Jimmy-rigged. So it got me to thinking that we clearly are not on the same level, and we have a different idea or different opinion on Jimmy-rigged versus jerry-rigged, and where the origins of that term came from. Overwhelming majority of people are under the belief that it is actually jerry-rigged. So I had to go to Google. And the first thing I found was the Webster's Dictionary definition of jury-rigged. So jury-rigged is an actual word in the dictionary, and it means having temporary makeshift rigging. And that is an actual dictionary definition. Jerry-built is something a little bit different. Jerry-built is actually also in the dictionary, and it is badly or hastily built with materials of poor quality. So difference, right? You just did a bad job. That's jerry-built. You did a job that was makeshift and impromptu. That's jury-rigged. And then there's Jimmy-rigged. And the only thing I could find, it's not in the dictionary, it is in the Urban Dictionary, and it is something freaking else. Jimmy-rig. This is the Urban Dictionary definition. Jimmy-rig, more intense version of jury-rig. A jury-rigged device will probably work, but be careful, a Jimmy-rigged device will probably not. But oh well. And my favorite part of Urban Dictionary is using it in a sentence. Here it goes. The car broke down? Well, I'm not surprised. I kind of had it Jimmy-rigged. So there you have it, folks. Jimmy-rigged, jury-rigged, jerry-rigged. I'm convinced that somewhere along the line, somebody got really drunk drunk and confused jury-rigged with jerry-rigged, and then Jerry turned into Jimmy and somebody forgot, and who knows. So if you're walking around saying Jimmy rigged like I was, you're wrong unless you're an Urban Dictionary believer. It's actually jury rigged is the appropriate term, not Jerry, not Jimmy. There is no such thing. Those are slang terms, and it is jury rigged. But before I kick you off to this conversation with Michael, I got to tell you all about that Ruble Roasting. I am sipping on Ruble Roasting right now. For those of you on YouTube, yes, out of my badass Star Wars mug. Go to rubleroasting.com. What you're going to find is a roast-to-order coffee roasting company. Yes, you heard it right. Everything is roast to order. Nothing is sitting on the shelf. Everything is fresh, so that when you get that bag of beans delivered to your doorstep, you are going to have in your hands the freshest coffee you can get your hands on. What that means is that flavor is going to be the boldest, most beautiful, slap-in-the-face flavor that you can possibly get your hands on, unless you're doing it yourself, which would be freaking badass. Also, it's all single origin coffee. What that means is there are no filler beans in there. It is all one type of bean. So it is the best coffee that you can get your hands on. I fell in love with this stuff, partnered up with the owner, PJ, and we agreed to give you guys, listeners of this podcast, a 10% discount on their coffee. So when you go to rubleroasting.com/coffee and click to order their beans, use IronCrew at checkout for 10% off. Go to rubleroasting.com/coffee, use IronCrew at checkout for 10% off. And without further delay, here is my conversation with Michael Sugrue.
Basically security and law enforcement.
So you knew from a very early age that you wanted to go down the military law enforcement path?
Absolutely. Actually, I've heard stories like when I was 5 and 6 years old, playing with soldiers and lining them up and having battle scenes. And I can't tell you how many times I dressed up as a soldier or a police officer for Halloween. I mean, as far back as I can remember, I mean, it's been a true passion, and I'd say even calling for me.
Yeah. So even back then, like when you think of your childhood, like what was it that drew you to that?
That's a tough question, but I would just say, honestly, I would say it was my stepfather. He was my absolute role model. I looked up to him in so many ways, and I think it's because of him. He's probably one of the greatest men I ever knew. He was a great husband to my mother, great father to me and to my brothers. Just admired him, and I liked what he did. I did forget I was actually a crime prevention volunteer for Sausalito PD, I think when I was 7 and 8 years old. So that just came to my memory. But so it actually does go really far back, and I've always had the passion for it.
That's cool.
I mean, I could even remember watching all the TV shows and all the cop TV shows, and it's just, I don't know. Like I said, I considered it a calling at the time.
Yeah, being real into it. And how long were you in the Air Force?
6.5 years active duty.
Okay. And then when you got out, that's when you started law enforcement?
Well, so I was in law enforcement in the military, and I was in Germany for a couple years. I moved back to Travis here in California, and my last year in, I started thinking about transitioning out. And I have to tell you, my original plan when I was in college was to always go into the military, but then it was to go into the FBI. And what happened was when I realized what the FBI actually does, that it's not really as exciting as I thought it was. And there's a lot of pitfalls, like moving around like the military. The pay is lower. I decided to go into civilian law enforcement. So while I was still in the Air Force, I applied to a couple different agencies. And I started my use or lose when I was actually in the police academy. So I was actually technically still in the Air Force while I was going through the police academy.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, so you go, and how old were you when you signed up to be a cop in the police academy?
Now you're asking me to do math.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, I remember for myself, I was hired with Salinas PD on my 24th birthday.
Okay.
And I believe about 6 weeks later, I was in the academy. So I was 24. Was it a little bit earlier or a little bit after
No, it was
that?
actually a few months before turning 30.
Oh, okay. So you had a little bit of life experience in you. You had gone through college. You had done some time in the military.
Absolutely.
Talk about the police academy and how like that started to change your perspective on your role within society, right? I mean, like you have to start thinking like, okay, now I'm just a regular civilian. Maybe you didn't think of that because you were already in the military, but there has to be a transition period, right? Where you're just like, holy crap, like I'm a little different than normal people now.
For me, I think that was true for a lot of people that were there that had no prior experience. But you have to understand, for me, my first assignment out of college, I was in charge of 60 people. And there was a lot of responsibility that came with that. And so at a very young age, when I went into the military, I kind of had to grow up quick. And I had to already have that role and have that mindset. So when I actually went into the police academy, I think I was probably leaps and bounds ahead of others just because I'd been there and done it. And I'd actually worked law enforcement, like I said, in the military. But it is different in the civilian side. So there was some learning curve as far as laws, things like that. But as far as interaction with people, society, I don't think that really changed so much then.
Right.
It was more just kind of learning the differences between the civilian side and the military side.
Right. Now, when you started your law enforcement career, how did that differentiate between the military side? Were there certain things that you felt were a little bit different on the law enforcement side as opposed to the military, and how did that compare?
Absolutely. The military is a lot more rigid, and it's a lot more formal, and there was some adjustment for me because I was very formal. I would say I was very rigid. Mm-hmm. And in law enforcement and dealing with people, there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of discretion. Everything's not black and white.
Right.
And so I think when I first started in law enforcement, I truly was more of a black and white person, and I didn't really see the in-between areas. I didn't really see the causes for things or why people are doing what they're doing. And I think that for me came with a lot of life experience, because as you know, being a former police officer and doing what you do now, that when you go through actual things in life or you see people go through it, that's how you really learn to deal with things. But it also gives you a different perspective on maybe, why are these people doing these things? Like, why are people using drugs? Why are people committing crimes?
Yeah.
I think of things a lot differently now than when I was a brand new cop, I can tell you.
Yeah.
And I think now it's a lot better. But back then, like I said, it's just, okay, here's the law. You broke the law, and that's it.
Yeah. And now, how do you look at it?
I have a lot more empathy and sympathy and compassion, and I can actually, I think, relate to a lot of people, and I can also, I know I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but with the volunteer work that I do, I know that a lot of things start in childhood, and a lot of people experience, whether it's childhood trauma, abusive parents, alcoholic parents, things like that. It really does have an effect on people. And it kind of forms them as they're growing up and going through life. And because of their personal experiences, that kind of changes their perception or why they do things, or learn behaviors even.
Yeah, so you have a little bit more empathy for the individual doing the certain thing that they're doing. Do you think that being like black and white helps cops now more than it used to? And the reason I'm asking that is because everything is on camera, right? Not only are civilians videoing everything that a police officer does, but your own department is now videoing it, right? Because you've got these body-worn cameras, and I feel like there's a little bit less room for gray area, because it almost has to be black and white for you to justify the thing that you did. Do you think that that's true or no?
I guess there's a couple of different ways to think of that. First off, I think the cameras are a great thing. Both body-worn and dash cameras. As a law enforcement officer, the thing is that we sometimes see and perceive things, and we have to make split-second decisions that the general public doesn't understand.
Right.
And, now with these cameras, you can review them, you can watch them. But in the past, when you wrote reports, it was based off your memory.
Right.
And, that's what you had to do is you experience something. It could be very traumatic. It could be a very long event. It could be multiple interviews of people. And it was all based on either notes or memory. And now you have the video camera. So I think that is very helpful. I also think that one of the biggest things about it is, and I've heard this a lot, is that it has cut down a lot of citizen complaints. Because a lot of times, and don't get me wrong, there's valid citizen complaints and there's invalid ones. And the tough thing is for departments to figure out which ones are the good ones, which ones are the bad ones.
Right.
Now with these cameras, they can go back and review them, and in many cases, not all, it can be pretty definitive. The cameras don't show everything, but a lot of times people will come in and they'll say, officer so-and-so did this, and then they'll watch the tape and play it for the person, and there you go. I mean, there's
Right.
no complaint to be had.
Right. What do you say to the person, maybe the officer, that says, oh man, these cameras, man, they add so much pressure to what we're doing, right? Like, because it seems like, and I can relate to this, where I'm thinking, okay, if I do this, then it's going to get scrutinized. I felt sometimes like it made me hesitate just a little bit, because I knew eventually it might get reviewed, right? What do you say to the officer that would potentially say something like that or feel that way?
For me, I always had the mentality that you're always being taped 24/7.
Right.
And that's how you should look at the job. And integrity, which is what this job is based on, is doing the right thing when no one's looking. And that's how I look at it, is that you should always be doing the right thing no matter what. And if you have that mentality, you shouldn't be concerned with the cameras, because you're going to do your job. You're going to go out there and do it well. You know what you're doing. I mean, mistakes are going to happen.
Right.
You may have times where an officer or somebody uses profanity, or they say something they shouldn't in the heat of the moment, but that happens. I've been there. I've done it. But when you're talking about, life-endangering situations, or situations where you need somebody to respond to what you're saying, it actually could be useful. It may not be deemed professional at the time, but it could be very useful.
Yeah, definitely. So you had talked about like profanities and, like dealing with the public. And, I always like to say that like officers are exposed to the bottom 3% of society. And even if it's not the bottom 3% of society, if I ask somebody like, when's the last time you called 911 and what was the situation? It was probably a really shitty situation, right? Because like it got to the point where they couldn't handle it anymore. And then from an officer standpoint, going call to call, seeing people at their lowest point, how did that have an accumulative effect on your outlook on life in general, or did it?
Oh, no, it absolutely did. And I look at it differently now, and I think I'm actually aware of the effect that it had. But I think as officers, many don't realize the effect that it has, and it could go on for years and years to actually realize what's going on. But for me personally, I think it made me more of a negative person. I would say it probably made me more pessimistic than optimistic. I kind of lost some faith in humanity, and had difficulty trusting others. And when I say others, I don't mean people I worked with or officers or first responders. I just mean strangers, people in general. I've been lied to so many times. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard that are absolutely not true, and they're not true, and how many times people have changed their stories, and it just kind of starts to wear on you, and like you said, when you see the negative and the negative, I think it kind of like warps your sense of, I guess, people and reality, because like you're saying, you really do only see a small segment of the population. When people are having a great day or the best day of their life, they don't call us.
Right.
Like you said, they call us when they're having the absolute worst day of their life. Now, there are positive interactions and going to schools and kids thanking you for what you do, but like you said, I would say the majority of it is dealing with bad things, negative things.
So for the officer listening or the first responder listening, like what are some things that you would recommend them do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to help cope with that constant barrage of negativity on their day-to-day life?
Well, this goes part into the culture and the stigma of being a police officer, but, and I haven't been that long. I retired in July of last year. But we don't talk about things enough. That's the biggest thing. And the old mentality was, if you had a bad day, you had a bad call, maybe after work you'd grab a beer with a buddy and you guys would joke about it or talk about other things, but you never really talked about the issue. You never really admitted that something bothered you. And that's a thing, because for me personally, and I can't speak for everybody, but I never wanted to show weakness. I never wanted to show that Things bothered me. I couldn't get emotional on a call. You have to be in control at all times. You have to go into the most violent, dangerous situations there are, and you have to bring calm and order to those situations. And you can't get wrapped up into it. You can't break down at a scene. And so when you go to these fatal car accidents, when you see children, especially who are injured or worst case scenario, that actually die in front of you, when you go to domestic violence calls and you see people being abused and kids being abused, that stuff absolutely takes a toll. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, we don't talk about it. We don't admit it. We just go on to the next call. There could be some days where you're just going call to call to call to call, and you don't even have time to absorb or think about what you just came from. Because if you did, you wouldn't be able to go to the next call. And that's the thing, is when we're out there, you need law enforcement 24 hours a day. And so if every bad call we go to, and I just go, hey boss, I got to take a break. I can't work. I need to go home. This was just too rough. I mean, it doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, it's showing weakness, like you said.
It is showing weakness. And the thing is, absolutely, you have to talk about it. And I think agencies and people are getting better with peer support, with debriefing things, which is often done now when a major incident happens or something considered more traumatic than normal. There are debriefings that happen where a lot of times agencies will bring in a therapist or a clinician. They'll bring in the people that were involved in that incident to kind of discuss their point of view, how it affected them. And so I think that's getting a lot better. I think there's a long way to go with that.
Yeah.
But for me personally, too, is I didn't ever want to bring the job home. I'm divorced now, but I was married when I was a police officer. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that I made personally was I didn't talk to my spouse about the job. I didn't truly talk about when I had a bad day, why I had a bad day. I would just come home pissed off. Didn't want to talk to anybody, didn't want to deal with anybody. I wanted to isolate. I didn't want to be social. And I think that is extremely common with law enforcement officers and first responders, where they're just like, you know what, I had a shitty day, and I'm going to leave that at work. I'm not bringing it home. So you think you're protecting your family, but you're absolutely not. You're actually hurting your family. So that, I think, first and foremost is the biggest thing. Obviously, I know you're into fitness. I'm into fitness. I work out every single day, and I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
You have to maintain a healthy lifestyle. You have to maintain a healthy body, but it's tough. When I was working 12.5-hour shifts, but I was commuting, so you're looking at 15, 16-hour work days. You may have court in the middle of that. You're waking up in the middle of your sleep. The stress alone of the job. You're eating crappy on the job. So, you got to make it a priority to eat right, to work out, to take care of your body. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's like you just want to drink a beer when you get off.
Right.
You don't want to think about going to the gym. You're exhausted mentally and physically. So I think that's also a big one. But, the biggest thing is just talking about it, getting it out there, and being human.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is I wasn't human for a long time. I was, I had this front up. I was invincible. Nothing bothered me. And it took some events that were a wake-up call for me. And it taught me that, what, I can die. And I almost did die. And those things really do change you.
Yeah.
And now I'm to the point, years after, I can talk about it. But I didn't talk about things for years. Mm-hmm. I mean, just years, just locked it away, and just it kept building and building and building.
And initially you had talked about that like compounding effect, right? Like all those little things that just kind of stacked on top of each other. You had mentioned a couple of things like going out for a beer. I remember the old saying of, when you laugh as cops, when you laugh, you're actually crying, right? And that's kind of like you hear officers joke, you hear first responders joke at scenes. I actually had a recent experience. I wasn't there personally, but hearing the person talk about it later, somebody had a heart attack and died at the gym. And the first responder that got there was a paramedic, EMT, I think. And I guess the call had come out and it didn't seem like it was as bad as it was. And so the EMT or first responder on scene within earshot, said something to the effect of, "Oh, wow, I didn't realize this was that bad." And so the person that heard that was like, "What are you talking about? Like, I was here with this person the whole time. It sure as hell was that bad, But, when we laugh, we cry, and those are some of the coping things that officers do. So what are some other things that an officer or a first responder might experience that are kind of red flags, right? Of the fact that all of these compounding situations are actually having an effect on them. You touched on a couple of them, like, going out and having a beer, being silent with your partner. Are there any other things that might be red flags for people to say, hey, look, maybe I should start talking about this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of red flags. I think one of the biggest ones is lack of patience, losing your cool very easily, whether that's on the job or at home, or if you're a parent with your kids. I think that's a big red flag when the little things start to really bother you and almost make you explode. I talked about the isolation. That's another big thing. I found that I was when I was in college, I was very social. I was very outgoing. I was in a fraternity, had a lot of friends, played sports, and when I got into law enforcement, like, my friend pool dropped down. I didn't want to go to parties. I didn't want to socialize. It's like when I was off, I just wanted to be in my safe place, which is my house, and just be there. And be there with my family, but the sad thing was really wasn't there with my family,
Mentally, you're kind of checked out. Right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
And I know, going to events and social things, I'm sure you experienced this, but whenever anybody finds out you're a cop, it's like everybody wants to come over and talk to you and tell you about their story, or tell you about their friend, or tell you about some asshole interaction they had with a cop, or something they saw on TV. And it's just like, you don't want to talk about that stuff and think about that stuff when you're off.
Yeah, you can't get away from the job.
No, you can't. Yeah. And, so that's another thing. Obviously, when you're starting to use alcohol, and you're starting to use it too much to numb yourself, that's a major red flag. When you feel like any kind of social gathering you go to, whether it's family or friends, that you need alcohol before you can go there to kind of help numb you and kind of help you deal with it, that's a major red flag.
Yeah.
When you go home and when you're actually off and when you need alcohol to actually go to sleep, or you're just like, I don't want to think about all these things running through my head or everything at work, and you need alcohol to cope with that, I think that's a major red flag.
Yeah.
And some of these things go hand in hand. You talk about the alcohol use, you talk about losing your temper, you talk about isolation. These things all kind of go together and they overlap each other. So it's not like there's going to be just one of these things going on. Usually there's going to be multiple things going on.
Yeah, is being a cop nowadays a young man's game? Meaning, is it designed to be a 30-year career anymore, or is it? And if so, how does somebody withstand and get out after 30 years, relatively okay?
Well, this is the funny thing about that. So, and I've been involved in a lot of different aspects of policing, but looking at hiring recruits and training, sometimes when you hire people too young, and 21 is the minimum age, but they don't have life experience. They haven't seen things, done things, and they don't usually do as well in the beginning. And so I think it's actually better for people to wait a few years before you go into law enforcement, to actually go to school, go into the military, get some life experience, because that's what you're bringing to the table. Being a police officer is kind of like being a social worker. It's the ability to interact with different people, to educate people, to know how to talk to people, and you can't learn that in a police academy.
Right.
But to answer your question about the longevity is, that's the thing, is with this retirement systems and they're changing, the retirement age has gone up. It's now 57. And so if you start at 21 and you work till you're 57, I'm sorry, but I don't see how you're going to make that. I mean, not just, I'm talking about the stress and the mental aspects, but the physical aspects.
Yeah.
Of, driving that patrol car every day, wearing 35 pounds of gear, your belt, your vest, all that stuff, the constant stress, the adrenaline dumps, the crappy eating, the lack of sleep. I mean, there's no way.
Yeah, how do you go 36, 7 years or whatever doing that, right?
It's very rare, but here's the funny thing. Well, it's not really funny, but I can kind of laugh about it now, is when I started, I was a hard charger. I took pride in what I did, and when I say I was a hard charger, I mean I made more arrests than anybody. I wrote more tickets than anybody. I worked my ass off.
All the salty dogs hated you, right?
Oh, they hated me, and I didn't understand why. Right. I didn't understand why. Now I absolutely understand why. But here's the thing is, and you probably knew them, but there's a few guys that we call them the slugs.
Right, yeah.
And not even necessarily old timers, because you know what? The old timers are different. They've been there, they've done it, and they've earned it. And looking at it now, like, they just want to get out there and do what they got to do and go home. So I get it.
Right.
The slugs are the ones that just don't care. They're like, I'm here. It's a job. I don't really put my heart into it. Well, those are the guys that actually have no problems. Those are the guys that retire. You don't ever hear anything about them.
It doesn't weigh on them the same way it does someone like you.
But when you're a hard charger and you're going out there every single day giving 110%, I mean, every single day, it takes a toll.
Yeah.
Absolutely takes a toll. You know, and for me, looking back, it's like, man, if I was a slug, maybe I wouldn't be where I am today.
Yeah.
And that's good and bad. But yeah, I don't see how anybody could work that long of a career now.
So somebody just starting out in law enforcement, I mean, would you kind of plant the seed in their mind that maybe they're not going to retire as a police officer at age 57? Like, they might not make it there, or, you know what I mean? Like, I remember when I was in the police academy, the instructor said, half of you raise your hand. And he was like, the ones that didn't raise your hand, that's about half of you guys are going to retire after 30 years in law enforcement. The other half just, you know, you'll flunk out of the academy, you'll retire early, you'll get fired, whatever, right? And at the time I was like, man, like, that's not going to be me. And it was, right? Like, it was me. Would you kind of like want to shift the person's perspective, or at least most people's perspective on that?
Yeah, there's a couple things. You know, I think it is possible to work that long if you do the right things and take care of yourself from the start through your entire career. A lot of the new people, the officers, when they start, and I'm sure you can remember this, but they work a ton of overtime.
Yes.
They're usually single, they're young, it's their first real job, they're making their first like real paycheck, and they want to buy the toys. And when you're that young officer, it's all about the new car, it's about the motorcycle, the boats, the toys. And so these guys and gals, they work a gazillion hours of overtime and just burn themselves out. I mean, they literally have no time off, and they're working every single day.
Yeah.
And that's the start of the decline. And there's no way that you can withstand that. You can keep doing that through your whole career. I do think if you pace yourself and you take care of yourself, I think it's possible. But like you said, you know, you may not work that long. You really don't know what's going to happen to you. I've seen officers that have, like you said, worked 2 years and they're done.
Yeah.
I've heard of an officer that was involved in a shooting in the field training program, which means they're a brand new officer out of the academy, and they were done, absolutely done, right then and there. So, yeah, it just runs the gamut. The advice I would give is that go into it with an open mind, take care of yourself, and know that you may not actually make it to those 30 years. And now 36 years or whatever that may be.
Right. You had mentioned earlier that you had almost died.
Correct. Well, a few times.
Yeah.
But there's one incident in particular.
What happened with that?
I'll keep it brief. But basically, I was a brand new sergeant. I had just been promoted. And it was the shift. It was a night shift. So at that time, it started at 9:30 at night. It was going till 7:30 in the morning. The shift started the day after Christmas, and I had a team with me. It was just myself and 4 officers on the street after the other team went home. So now we're talking, I think it was like 1:30 in the morning. We're basically it for the city. It's our Friday. We just have to work 6 more hours, and we're going home for the weekend. About 3:15, 3:17 in the morning, call comes out with there's a female who calls 911. And she's saying that she's barricaded inside her apartment and there's a guy with a knife. And immediately I start going, the other officers start going. As we're driving there, they give an update, and the woman now says that her and her boyfriend are actually in the bedroom barricaded, and there's a guy with a knife. So it turns out that there was a couple and then a guy with a knife that was inside this unit. It was in a very... Well, it was basically an area that was very congested with condominiums and apartment buildings. And although I knew the area, and I knew where the building was, I didn't know exactly where this unit was. And so we're trying to get there as quickly as we can, because this is a very serious call.
Right.
I'm actually first on scene, and there's another female officer that gets there, and we immediately start running towards this condo. It turns out to be a 2-story condo. and we can hear a female screaming. It sounds like she's being killed or dying. It's one of the worst sounds I've ever heard in my life. We eventually get there and notice that there's a huge window the size of a door that is actually smashed into the condominium. My partner and I, we go in, and it's dead silent at that moment. Clear the downstairs. It's dark. There's no one there. We get to the bottom of the staircase, and then there's a guy who comes out with a butcher knife in his hands. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically we gave him repeated commands to drop the knife. We had our guns out, and he looked like a zombie. His eyes were wide open. He was sweating profusely. He had no reaction to what we were saying. It was almost like he was staring like straight through us. It was something out of like a horror movie.
Yeah,
is the best way to describe it, and it's something that I've never seen before. And I'll never forget his eyes. It was horrible. And eventually he charged us with the knife. We shot. He came down the bottom of the stairs. At this point, there's two other officers in the condominium. Two of the officers retreated to there's like a family area, and another male officer and myself were continuing to give the subject commands. He still had the knife in his hands, and he started to come back up at us, and we had to shoot again. He was killed, and I took someone's life. And, we saved the couple that was upstairs. It turns out that he was probably seconds away from getting into that bedroom.
Yeah.
He was actually stabbing the knife through the door, and had we not been there, that couple would have been killed.
Was
no
this
doubt.
a random stranger that walked or broke into the house, or?
We thought it was.
Yeah.
And when the call came out, and that's the thing too, is when you get these calls, you get very limited information.
Yeah, you don't know.
You don't know. And I didn't know till after the whole thing was done. And it turns out that he actually lived there. So there was 3 males that lived there. One of them was gone for the holidays, and then the other had his girlfriend over for the night. So there was 3 people inside the condo that night. And earlier in the night, before we had got there and before they called 911, he actually woke up in the middle of the night and went into the other male and girlfriend's bedroom and started choking him. And they tried talking to him. He was unresponsive. They'd never seen anything like this. And they were actually able to get this guy, they're both wrestlers. The boyfriend was able to wrestle this guy, get him outside the condo, lock the door. They ran back upstairs, barricaded themselves, and called 911. And then he actually broke through the window, we're assuming grabbed a butcher knife out of the kitchen, and went straight up to the room where they were barricaded.
Was he on drugs, or was he drunk, or
we don't
ever get that?
We don't know.
Yeah.
I know there was some trace amounts of marijuana, I think, found in his system, and there was some talk that he had used, I think, ecstasy. I don't know if it was a week earlier, the time frame, but the issue is we don't know if there was a psychotic break. We don't know what happened.
Wow.
And that's what makes this very difficult for me. This wasn't some serial killer. This wasn't some parolee who, had been in a gang and shot people. I mean, this for all intents and purposes was a normal person. And to this day, we don't know exactly what happened to him. And that's shitty. It's shitty for everybody.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that although we did the right thing, and that there is no doubt that we saved those 2 people's lives and saved our own lives, that nobody ever wants to take a human life.
Right.
And I have to live with that for the rest of my life. And that's something that to this day that I still struggle with. And I can say that now. I couldn't say it then because that would have been weakness. And you can't show weakness in the job, right? You just can't. And especially not as a leader or as a patrol sergeant. I was the one in charge that night. I was the watch commander for the entire city.
Right.
And so it was me. And it wasn't easy.
So how long ago did that happen?
Well, that actually happened December 27th, 2012.
So you had mentioned that you had struggled with it and still do. What kinds of things, how does that manifest itself?
Well, initially I was in complete denial, and what happened, it's kind of a very long story, so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. But we were immediately sued by the family, civil lawsuit, and so with that being said, that lawsuit actually did not get resolved until September of 2016. So we're talking almost 4 years. I was actually a defendant in federal civil court and went through a full jury trial. We ended up winning the case. Not that anybody wins this type of case,
Right.
but the judge, Judge Breyer, he's actually the brother of the Supreme Court Justice Breyer. He even commented at the end that, we, had it not been for actions, there would have been more lives lost that night. But the thing is that when this happened, you go through the process, you go through the interviews. It's kind of like a fog at first. Like you can't even fathom that this actually happened. It's almost like it's not real.
Yeah, like you're living a dream.
Yeah, it's just like I remember that night because it's like I had dinner with my family. I had a very young daughter at the time. She was only 2 years old, and I remember I had a great night. Went to the gym, had dinner. It was like after Christmas, and the thing was that after that, my entire life changed, and I didn't realize how much. But when I finally went home after this, and I think it was late in the afternoon the next day, so I'd been up for a long time and been through some interviews. And when I got home, I just wanted to go to bed. I wanted to be by myself. I didn't want to see anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to kind of like forget it. But you can't obviously forget something like this.
Yeah.
And that started my isolation.
And that was 2012.
That was the end of 2012, correct.
Okay.
Now I'm gonna tell you something that happened after that, and it was related to this. But we have in our county what's called a coroner's inquest.
Right.
And it happened in May. And a coroner's inquest, it's basically where there's a commissioner or judge there. There's a jury. It's an open courtroom, so reporters can be there. Anybody from the public can be there. And they kind of determine the manner mode of how the person died. And there's different findings that are there, which isn't important for this discussion, but what is important was on that day, that was the first day that I heard the dispatch tapes for this incident. And you can hear our dispatcher basically screaming, and you can hear the panic in her voice. And you can also, it was the first time I heard our voices, because our voices obviously were recorded on the police radios. And at the time, my wife was there. I would say a good portion of the police department was there. And I had to relive that night, and I had to speak to it. And I broke down in the courtroom. I absolutely cried like a baby in front of this jury. And the judge thanked me and said, "We have what we need," and excused me. And I left the courtroom for, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes to compose myself. Because you have to understand, and I know this sounds probably crazy, but at that point, I don't know if I'd ever cried in front of anybody.
Yeah.
And, I'd been this former Air Force captain, security forces, and at this point, I was also undercover on a state drug task for 3 years. I was a sergeant, and to me, that was showing weakness, and I had never done that before. And so I ended up composing myself, going back to the courtroom, and the hearing's done with, and a week or two later, we get the best finding that we could, and after that, I ended up getting called into an office, and I'm not going to mention names or specifics, but what happened in that office was a couple things. And one of them was that the genuineness of my emotions was questioned, and my leadership abilities were questioned. And this was a pivotal moment for me because what happened was after this meeting, I absolutely locked everything inside myself and told myself I was not going to show emotion ever again, and that I was just going to press on with my job and my life and not let this affect me. And that's all there was going to be to it. And the thing is, at that moment, if they would have seen what happened to me on that stand and seen that here's this guy who's never shown emotion, and this is one of those red flags you're talking about.
Right.
And here he is basically crying like a baby.
Yeah.
And losing his shit in a courtroom, which never happened and shouldn't happen. Maybe we should get this guy some help.
Yeah.
Maybe we should see what's going on. But what I felt was the opposite of that, and I felt like it was coming down on me. And, you know, what you have to understand for me is like we talked about being a hard charger, I've always had absolute pride in my career and what I've done. I've always had aspirations to keep going to the next level, and that just really, really took a toll on me. And because of that, what happened is I locked it away.
Yeah, so finally you let all of these emotions out. You opened up. Never cried in front of anybody.
Yeah.
Right. You cry in front of a judge and an audience.
A full room.
A full room.
Yeah. I mean, I was embarrassed. You're this big polarizing figure. You've wanted to be a cop and a hard charger and a military guy from the very beginning, since you were 8 or 6 or whatever. And all of this happens, and then when you let it out, it kind of gets shut down. Like, hey, we don't even believe you. This is what I'm hearing. Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, during this time frame now, my marriage is starting to fall apart, and I'm basically an asshole, honestly. I mean, that's the easy way to put it, is I become a asshole who doesn't care, who doesn't show emotion. I become an asshole boss, and I go the polar opposite of where I should go.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, is that through this whole process, I found out I'm actually a very caring person. Like, I actually give a shit about people. I show emotion now. And it's like I can really be myself now, whereas before I couldn't be myself. But I didn't realize it till that moment when that got shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize it again until after I've gone through my treatment, after I've gone through everything, and I've been through a lot, and I'm still going through it right now, but to where now I can look back and I'm like, this is actually in some ways a blessing, because if I didn't get help, I don't know where, well, I might not be alive right now, honestly, but now I can just be myself and not worry about portraying an image, about putting up a front with anybody. I can just be me and express what I want to express, whereas I couldn't do that. For me, it was weakness. It was embarrassment. It was people are going to look at me like, we don't want to work for this guy. Like, we don't want to be around this guy. Mm-hmm. We don't trust this guy. It was just, there was a whole lot of feelings going through my head to where, I just could not show weakness. And because of that, I became an asshole.
Yeah, you're pushing everybody away, right? Like, you're not going to accept me for what I wanted to bring out, which
Absolutely.
was emotion and tears and vulnerability. And now I'm just going to be like, fuck you guys, right? Because you're not going to accept me for what I'm feeling anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And here's the deal. Most of the public doesn't understand this, but most officers aren't involved in shootings, period.
Right.
I think it's less than 1% that actually shoot somebody. As an example, my stepfather, who raised me, 34 years in law enforcement, worked in Richmond, one of the worst cities.
Yeah.
He'd been in or involved in shootings, but he never shot anybody.
Yeah.
Just as an example. And I know with the media and the news, it makes it seem like officers are shooting somebody every single day. Mm-hmm. And it just doesn't happen. And most officers go their entire 30-year career without ever having to shoot somebody.
Yeah.
And for me, I didn't know anybody else other than one person who had been involved in a shooting. And that person was a great person, but he was very high up in administration, and I just didn't have that comfort level to talk to them about it. And so other than the people I was involved with in my shooting, I didn't have anybody that I could go to, that I could talk to about what I might be feeling, about maybe what they felt. And I think that was a big issue for me, is maybe if I would have had something like that, or I had a peer who had been involved in something similar,
right?
And not with my agency per se, but just somebody with another agency or somebody with a similar background that I could feel comfortable with opening up to. And I never had that resource.
Yeah.
And so now I want to be that resource. That's where I'm at today, is that I want to be able to help other people, whether it's my old agency or whether it's firefighters, paramedics, cops, dispatchers. I just want to be real with them. I don't have all the answers, but I can at least tell my story, talk about what I've been through, and maybe it helps one person. And if it does, that's all that matters.
Yeah, and be that person that you wish somebody was there for you, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're reaching about 50 minutes here. I want to be respectful of your time. I ask a couple of questions of all my guests at the end, and number one is, what is one thing that you tell yourself when you start to get discouraged?
Well, now my daughter's my everything, so everything revolves around her. And so if I start to feel discouraged, I start to feel down, I just remind myself that you need to be the best dad you can for her. And that is my sole purpose in life now, is just to be the best father I can be. And so when I remind myself of that, it kind of brings me back, gets me focused, and gets me in the right mindset.
Yeah. That's awesome. How old is she?
She'll be 9 in August.
My daughter's 10 and a half.
It's a great age, but I'm not looking forward to the teen years.
Stand by, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The second one is, what is your greatest fear, and what are you doing to try to overcome that fear?
This is a tough one, and this didn't come out until my shooting, but my biggest fear is dying.
Yeah.
But within that, my biggest fear is not being here for my daughter, and so that's really my biggest fear. And until my shooting, I never thought about dying. I never thought I would die. And after my shooting, it's all I can think about, and I still think about it to this day. It's one of my biggest struggles. I take care of myself, but I still think about I'm going to die all the time.
Yeah.
And it's horrible. Horrible.
Yeah.
But it's reality. And the goal is to not think about it as much, and that's something that I'm still working on today.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I want to end on is, for listeners who are not in law enforcement or in law enforcement, is, we drive around, and now that I'm out of it for a couple of years now, almost 3, I see cops all the time, and part of me misses it, but a part of me does, and a big part of me does not. But you have these instant things that you think about when you think of a police officer, especially when you're just driving down the road, or you see him at a Starbucks, or off to the side of the road. I feel like oftentimes it's a relatively negative thought, meaning, oh, you see a cop behind you in the rearview mirror, it's like, oh shit, there's a cop, right? Got to slow down. Or, if you see him at a Starbucks, you're like, oh, what a lazy cop, just sitting around drinking coffee all day. What is one thing that you wish people knew about cops that they might not have thought about, so that next time they see them either on the side of the road, behind them, or at a Starbucks, what is one thing that you wish that people knew about a cop that would help them relate to them a little bit better?
I don't know if it's just one thing, but the simple thing is that we're human, and we have families. Oftentimes we are parents, or we're brothers and sisters, or we're sons and daughters. But we have our own struggles. We have our own things that we're dealing with. And just to know that the things that we see and deal with on a daily basis is something that no human should ever have to see. And when I say that, I mean paramedics, I mean dispatchers, I mean firefighters, I mean police officers. It takes an absolute toll. And, the thing is that police officers, they have a job to do, and their job is to protect and to serve. And there's a lot of things that come with that. And with that is a lot of missed holidays, a lot of missed Little League games with their kids,
Yeah.
a lot of missed sleep, and just know that they're probably going through as much as you are in their own way. And just know that we're all human. We really are.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, it's just a good reminder, right? Because you see the badge, you see the gun, you see the vest, you see the uniform, and it's almost like you just see RoboCop, right? All cops look alike. That's you hear that often,
Absolutely.
right? Like, they're just a cop, they're all the same. When in reality, they are an actual human being underneath that badge, right?
But also know that, like myself, most of those, maybe I'm overspeaking here, but a lot of those cops don't feel comfortable sharing their emotions, sharing what they're going through. And so they're going through all this stuff and they have no outlet. And that's the hardest part for me, is that I know there's so many first responders out there that are struggling right now and that need help, but they're afraid to ask for it.
Yeah.
And it's just know that it gets better. I'm in a lot better place now than I was. I still have work to do, but just know that even though it was the hardest thing I did was to ask for help, I'm so glad I did it, because had I not, I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah. And if somebody's listening to that exact message, where can they find you? Because you're there to help them, right?
I am there to help them. I am on LinkedIn is probably the easiest way.
Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of articles there on PTSD. I also honor every time an officer dies in the line of duty. I'm also doing a lot to address police suicide on there. But one of the best organizations, and it's one that I volunteer for, it's called the First Responder Support Network. And they run something called the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat. And I went through it actually as a client. And it is absolutely life-changing. Life-changing. You can Google it. You can check it out online. It's open to dispatchers, paramedics, firefighters, police officers. And it's a lifesaver. I'm just going to put it that way.
Yeah.
It's an absolute lifesaver. And I cannot speak highly enough about the program. I could speak for hours on here about it, but I won't for obvious reasons. But just remember the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat. And it's part of the First Responder Support Network, which is based out of, I believe, San Rafael, California.
Okay.
But this retreat is all over now. They have them in Oregon, Arizona, California, and it's phenomenal. So
awesome.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
And for the first responders out there, most agencies are aware of it. They do post-training on it. They do advanced peer support training on it. But it's actually a very well-known program and absolute lifesaver. So I would say, hey, you know what? If you need to, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I can try to help you with some resources. Or if you just want to talk, if you need somebody to talk to, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Absolutely. Well, appreciate your time, man. And you're doing great things on LinkedIn. I love it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Where can you find Michael? Primarily on LinkedIn. Yes, my favorite platform, LinkedIn. That's Michael Sugrue, Sugrue, and that is on LinkedIn. You can also support his cause by checking out the website. That is frsn.org. That's that first responder support network that he volunteers his time to help those struggling with PTSI. How can you guys support this podcast? You can support this podcast in many ways, and I will lay it out for you guys with the easiest all the way to the most difficult. Number one, subscribe to the podcast. If you haven't already done so, subscribe. And if you're feeling up for it, leave a rating and a review. Please make it a good, honest rating and a good, honest review. It does help if you do that. And if you haven't done so, please go do that now on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you're listening to this podcast. Number two, check out the website. That's ironcrew-athletics.com. If you haven't already, click the follow button. Every time a new blog, every time a new podcast, every time a new video instructional tutorial goes up, you will get notified of that via the website and email. Number three, the YouTube channel. Go to the YouTube channel. That's Iron Crew Athletics. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and share all of those things with as many people as you can. So share the podcast, share the website, share the YouTube channel. Get notified of all of the things that I'm up to on those platforms for as much free content as I can possibly provide for you guys. Number 4, you can follow me on any one of my social media platforms, starting with Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest. Those are all Iron Crew Athletics. You can also follow me on my personal, that's Danny Birdie on Facebook, and at DannyBirdie009 on Instagram. On those platforms, don't forget Twitter, that's at Iron Crew Athlete, and LinkedIn, that's Danny Birdie. On those platforms, if there is a story to be had, I will post all of my daily happenings on the story. So you're going to get original stuff on the story. You're going to get weekly posts on the post on the wall, and you're going to get updated on my daily life on all of those platforms. So if you haven't already, whichever one you use most, go over to that, check it out, either Iron Crew Athletics, Iron Crew Athlete on Twitter, or my name, Danny Birdie, on Facebook and or LinkedIn. Number 5, you can check out Ruble Roasting. You can check out Ruble Roasting, order their bag of beans when you go to checkout. Use Iron Crew at checkout for 10% off. Also, Kingsfield Fitness, if mobility matters to you and you want to loosen up those tight muscles, check out their 4-speed vibrating foam roller. That is kingsfieldfitness.com. I got the hookup code for you. That's 20% off if you use Iron Crew, all one word, at checkout for that 4-speed vibrating foam roller from kingsfieldfitness.com. Number 6, you can order a t-shirt. For those of you on the YouTube channel, I'm wearing that badass t-shirt. I got black, I got gray, got women's tanks, got kids, all sizes. Check it out. You can email me. That's ironcrewpodcast@gmail.com. You can email me with a request for the t-shirt, or you can just slide into one of my many DMs, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff, and inquire about a t-shirt. I will hook you up. And finally, a huge shout out to my man, Kung Fu Vampire, for providing the intro and outro music for this podcast. You can check him out on his website, kungfuvampire.com. Also on his social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. That's at Kung Fu Vampire. And that about does it, my friends. Again, thank you for tuning in. Cue that sick-ass music by Kung Fu Vampire. I will see you guys next week.